My name is David Fays. I'm a member of Platypus. I discovered my first issue of the Platypus Review back in 2013, and I became a member in Chicago. I've also been a member in London when I was taking my master's at the School of Economics, and I'm now a member in New York, and I'm a student at Columbia University. So I also want to welcome you to the 15th Annual International Convention of the Platypus Affiliated Society. The Platypus Affiliated Society was established in December 2006. It organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism, focus on the problems and tasks inherited from the old left of the 1920s, 1930s, the new left of the 1960s, 1970s, and the post-political left of the 1980s and 1990s, for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. You can learn more about the local activities of this chapter of the Platypus Affiliated Society by reaching out to the Facebook group Platypus Chicago or the email platypus.chicago@gmail.com. The reading groups here at UChicago are Sundays at Harper 135 from 12 to 3, and the coffee breaks are Wednesdays at Hutchinson Commons from 4:30 to 5:30. And you can reach out to like Pam, for instance, to hear if you want to know more about what's going on in Chicago. So this event is called Second International Marxism in America that will never return, or does the political and societal terrain of capitalism remain in some way unchanged from Debs' time to our own, such that the horizons of the SPA remain our own? So without further ado, I will let Spencer take the mic.
Thanks, David. This is a little rough. I revised it last night on my flight here and left the tablet on the plane. So I might have to ad-lib a little bit. I've been asked to briefly represent the views of socialists in general and Marx and Engels in particular up to the time of the formation of the First International in the middle of the 1860s. And broadly what I'm going to be talking about is how the United States is simultaneously advanced and backward from the point of view of European socialist thinkers up to the time when the crisis of the American Republic in the US Civil War serves as the galvanizing event for the formation of the First International. For the most part, America seemed outside the frame of capitalism and socialism for much of the early period of formation of socialism, including for Marx and Engels. In this respect, we can say that, as always, they followed reality. And what I mean by this is that, unlike in Europe, especially in Britain and France, but so to speak, by extension, in Germany as well, socialism posed itself as a question, as what was variously termed the social question or the condition of England question in the, to put no finer point on it, 1840s, when Marx and Engels were coming of age. Not so much in the United States, which was simultaneously free and backward. So Marx, in his, and I'm going to quote this letter a good deal, Marx's letter to Abraham, or to the people of the United States, congratulating them on the re-election of Abraham Lincoln in 1864, a letter that was drafted in early 1865, and is one of the first expressions of the First International. Marx, in his capacity as secretary, wrote expressing, in a sense, the first half of the 20th century's view of America. In America, the idea of one great democratic republic first sprung up, whence the first Declaration of the Rights of Man was issued and the first impulse given to the European Revolution of the 18th century. America stood as both a beacon to and a refuge for Europe. Marx and Engels, like other early socialists, followed the Enlightenment in regarding the United States as what Hegel famously called the land of the future. It's a very tricky formulation, actually. Here is the passage in which Hegel discusses America in his lectures on the philosophy of history. As to the political condition of North America, the general object of the existence of the state is not yet fixed and determined, and the necessity for a firm combination does not yet exist. For a real state and a real government arise only after a distinction of classes has arisen, when wealth and poverty become extreme, and when such a condition of things presents itself that a large portion of the people can no longer satisfy its necessities in the way in which it has been accustomed so to do. But America is hitherto exempt from this pressure, for it has the outlet of colonization constantly and widely open, and multitudes are continually streaming into the plains of the Mississippi. By this means, the chief source of discontent is removed. Only when, as in Europe, the direct increase of agriculturalists is checked, will the inhabitants, instead of pressing outwards to occupy the fields, press inwards upon each other, pursuing town occupations and trading with their fellow citizens, and so form a compact system of civil society and require an organized state. America is therefore the land of the future, where in the ages that lie before us, the burden of the world's history shall reveal itself. It is a land of desire for all those who are weary of the historical lumber room of old Europe. Napoleon is reported to have said, "Cette vieille Europe m'ennuie," and this old Europe bores me. It is for America to abandon the ground on which hitherto the history of the world has developed itself. Hegel's view was not particularly distinctive. For instance, Charles Fourier, perhaps following Adam Smith, felt that the United States could develop free of the social question because in new areas like the United States, labor is lacking. Robert Owen, for his part, established utopian communities in the United States, even addressing Congress on, quote, the new system of society in 1825. And the utopian socialist and friend of Lafayette's, Francis Wright, went so far as to attempt combining Owenite principles of harmony with Jefferson's plans for the gradual abolition of slavery in the community that she helped to establish at Neshoba, near present-day Germantown, Tennessee. As Jefferson wrote to Wright at the time, "At the age of 82, with one foot in the grave and the other uplifted to follow it, I do not permit myself to take part in any new enterprises, even for the bettering of the condition of man. Not even in the great one, which is the subject of your letter, and which has been, through life, that of my greatest anxieties. The march of events has not yet been such as to render its completion practicable within the limits of time allotted to me." He's of course referring to the slavery question. "And I leave its accomplishment as the work of another generation. And I'm cheered when I see that on which it's devoted, taking it up with so much goodwill and such mind engaged in its encouragement. The abolition of the evil is not impossible. It ought never, therefore, to be despaired of. Every plan should be adopted, every experiment tried, which may do something towards the ultimate object." And as late as 1843, various forms of socialist commune were being established in the United States. Brook Farm being a substantial site for the incubation of American intellectuals, such as Margaret Fuller, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Horace Greeley, and Marx's future editor, Charles Dana. In the end, of course, what made America ideal for such socialist experiments, abundant cheap land, would also provoke the crisis of the Republic. Indeed, it was the acquisition of still more land from Mexico that served as the precipitating cause of the crisis of the 1850s. But to reiterate, and speaking in general terms, until the outbreak of the US Civil War, European radicals, including Marx and Engels, viewed America as standing largely outside the general fate of Europe, both on the ground of its republic enduring the general overthrow of the French Revolution after the 1815 Treaty of Vienna, and because of its persisting labor shortage and abundance of unsettled land. Slavery was, by and large, still considered a doomed institution, one whose abolition, as as Jefferson remarked to right, would be accomplished as the work of post-revolutionary generations. In his youth, Marx wrote of the United States On the Jewish Question as the country of complete political emancipation. The revolution of 1776, its preservation through the revolution of 1800, through the election of Thomas Jefferson, and its further vindication in the War of 1812 by Jefferson's successor, James Madison. These meant that the state was emancipated from Judaism, from Christianity, from religion in general, unquote, and the disestablishment of religion was but the corollary of the emancipation of public reason, as the United States Constitution itself makes clear. As the First Amendment laconically states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances, unquote. Because its revolution still stood, because of its open frontier, and because of its buoyant labor market, America was, as Marx wrote in The Poverty of Philosophy, the most progressive of countries. The Enlightenment conception of the United States, expressed by Hegel with his laconic phrase, the land of the future, still endured. The very industrialization of the United States was not driven by proletarianization, as it was driven by the distinctly American shortage of labor. Quote, where North America is concerned, the introduction of machinery is brought about both by competition with other nations and by scarcity of labor, i.e. by the disproportion between the population and the industrial requirements of North America, unquote. That's Marx in 1846 in his letter to Pavel Annenkov. During the Revolution of 1848, Marx and Engels expected, or at least hoped with revolutionary fervor, that Great Britain would be drawn into the continental convulsion, and ultimately by the domestic crisis to which the ruling class's action, the British ruling class's action might provoke, the British working class might be forced to take the lead in affairs. As Engels wrote when the Revolution of 1840 broke out, in a couple of months, my friend, the Chartist, G. Julian Harney, will be in Prime Minister Lord Palmerston's shoes. But as for America and its war with Mexico, there persisted an older frame of reference. America was still the land of the future. It was outside the frame, as I say. If the question was beginning to take shape for some Americans of whether the Mexican War would be a new conquest for the empire of liberty, or rather for a new empire of slavery, Engels's American optimism led him to assume the latter. As he wrote in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung by way of criticizing Bakunin during the Revolution, the United States and Mexico are two republics, in both of which the people is sovereign. How did it happen that over Texas, a war broke out between these two republics? Bakunin assumed that if all people existed in a free republic, that there would be no wars between them. This is Engels criticizing that view. How did it happen that over Texas, a war broke out between these two republics? which according to moral theory, i.e. Bakunin, ought to have been fraternally united and federated. And that owing to, quote, geographical, commercial, and strategic necessities, the sovereign will of the American people, supported by the bravery of the American volunteers, shifted the boundaries drawn by nature some hundreds of miles further south. The boundaries drawn by nature is another dig at Bakunin, the idea that national boundaries are natural. And will Bakunin accuse the Americans of a war of conquest, which, although it deals with a severe blow to his theory based on justice and humanity, was nevertheless waged wholly and solely in the interest of civilization? Or is it perhaps unfortunate that splendid California has been taken away from the lazy Mexicans who could not do anything with it? That the energetic Yankees, by rapid exploitation of the California gold mines, will increase the means of circulation, in a few years will concentrate a dense population and extensive trade at the most suitable places on the coast of the Pacific Ocean, create large cities, open up communications by steamship, construct a railway from New York to San Francisco, for the first time really open the Pacific Ocean to civilization, and for the third time in history, give world trade a new direction. The independence of a few Spanish Californians and Texans may suffer because of it. In some places, justice and other moral principles may be violated. But what does that matter to such facts of world historic significance? Unquote. And Marx shared the underlying assumption that America was, as it were, still bourgeois, precisely because it was the land of the future. And this is really the key quote from the pre-Civil War period, from the 18th Brumaire. The defeat of the June insurgents in Paris, to be sure, had leveled the ground on which the bourgeois republic could be founded and built. But it had shown at the same time that in Europe, the questions at issue are other than that of republic or monarchy. It had revealed that here, bourgeois republic signifies the unlimited despotism of one class over other classes. It had proved that in countries with an old civilization, with a developed formation of classes, with modern conditions of production, and with an intellectual consciousness in which all the traditional ideas have been dissolved by the work of centuries, the republic signifies in general only the political form of revolution of bourgeois society, and not its conservative form of life, as, for example, in the United States of America, where, though classes already exist, they have not yet become fixed, but continually change and interchange their elements in constant flux, where the modern means of production, instead of coinciding with the stagnant and surplus population, rather compensate for the relative deficiency of heads and hands, and where, finally, the feverish, youthful movement of material production, which has to make a new world of its own, has neither time nor opportunity left for abolishing the old world of ghosts, unquote. This quote distills why, for Marx and Engels, the revolutionary strategy in which they were engaged in the Revolution of 1848 was essentially European. What followed in the 1850s, however, namely the rise of the slave power in the United States, and of course the consolidation of the Bonapartist world state with its, as it were, headquarters in Europe, threatened even the legacy of the bourgeois republic in North America, and this transformed their thinking. The working class movement for socialism in Marx and Engels' thinking after 1848 came to inherit the entire project of the modern revolution. and even the bourgeois revolution across the water was not safe. The secessionists' goal was to extend slavery into new territories within the United States and in alliance with Britain, France, and Spain to reverse the movement for independence and abolition across the Western Hemisphere. The first major step in this direction, Louis Bonaparte's expedition to conquer Mexico, Marx dubbed one of the most monstrous enterprises ever chronicled in the annals of international history. And just as French fleets were anchoring off Veracruz in December 1861, British Prime Minister Lord Palmerston, seizing the opportunity offered by the Trent Affair, sent 10,000 troops to Canada and threatened to send in addition at least twice that number more. Unlike in the Revolutionary War of 1776 to 83, or the War of 1812, the Union lacked any major European ally. Or rather, it did so until the moment the European powers were about to weigh in on the side of the Confederacy. The formation of the First International was a direct outgrowth of the expressions of working class and liberal solidarity with the Union cause against the manifest policy of both Britain and France, which was, as I've said, to support the Confederacy as soon as that was feasible. That is, as soon as the Confederacy vindicated in any measure its claim to national self-determination on the battlefield. For the opening years of the war, Marx wrote to his New York Tribune audience exposing the hypocrisy of British liberalism, especially British abolitionism, which played into Palmerston's hostility to the Union on the grounds that the Union wasn't anti-slavery enough. At the same time, Marx wrote for the Viennese liberal paper, Die Presse, sweeping analyses of the American conflict, helping to lay the groundwork for the European working class solidarity that would provide the basis for the formation of the First International. At the same time, in the early 1860s, he participated directly in working class solidarity actions across Britain. In the First International's famous letter, already quoted, congratulating the American people on the re-election of Abraham Lincoln, Marx summarizes the view he had come to over the course of the war. From the commencement of the titanic American strife, the working men of Europe felt instinctively that the Star-Spangled Banner carried the destiny of their class. The contest for the territories which opened the dire epopee, means epic poem, was it not to decide whether the virgin soil of immense tracts should be wedded to the labor of the immigrant or prostituted by the tramp of the slave driver? When an oligarchy of 300,000 slaveholders dared to inscribe for the first time in the annals of the world slavery on the banner of armed revolt, when on the very spots where hardly a century ago the idea of one great democratic republic had first sprung up, when the first Declaration of the Rights of Man was issued and the first impulse given to the European Revolution of the 18th century, when on those very spots, counter-revolution, with systematic thoroughness, gloried in rescinding the ideas entertained at the time of the formation of the old Constitution, and maintained slavery to be a beneficent institution. Indeed, the old solution of the great problem of the relation of capital to labor, and cynically proclaimed property in man the cornerstone of the new edifice. Then the working classes of Europe understood at once, even before the fanatic partisanship of the upper classes for the Confederate gentry had given its dismal warning, that the slaveholders' rebellion was to sound the tocsin for a general holy crusade of property against labor, and that for the men of labor, with their hopes for the future, even their past conquests were at stake in that tremendous conflict on the other side of the Atlantic, unquote. America demonstrated, yes, that the democratic republic of the New World that had previously seemed outside of the European orbit of social crisis was now drawn into it, but it also showed how the struggle for the simplest bourgeois revolutionary program might entail a global revolutionary crisis. The year 1864 saw Louis Bonaparte follow up his invasion of Mexico with the installation of Maximilian I, the younger brother of Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph I, on a newfangled Mexican imperial throne. Meanwhile, the British kept their eyes on the main chance should the Monroe Doctrine completely collapse. Foiling these schemes, Union victory marked the transition from the post-1848 counter-revolution to a time of taut political possibility globally, with backing from, fraught with political possibility globally. With backing from the United States, Mexican Republicans led by Benito Juarez captured and executed Maximilian I in 1867. In Europe, the 1863-4 January uprising in Tsarist Poland, the 1864 founding of the First International, the 1867 passage of the Second Great Reform Bill in Britain, the 1867 Fenian uprising in Ireland, the Glorious Revolution in Spain, overthrowing Queen Isabella II in 1868, the 1870 capture of Rome as the final act of the Italian Risorgimento, the liberalization then collapse of the Second French Empire, culminating in the Paris Commune, all absorbed, radicalized, and returned to America with interest, the impetus first given by the outbreak of civil war. Revolution ricocheted around the world before finally exhausting itself back where it began, with the Compromise of 1876 definitively ending the Reconstruction. The breaking of the Great Railroad Strike the following year confirmed that the fillip that Union victory and Reconstruction had given the cause of labor was exhausted, but not before Reconstruction, the passage of the 13th to 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, and the passing of free womb legislation in Cuba and Brazil placed, if they could not fully drive home, the final nails in the coffin of the old New World slavery. But more importantly, the crucial lesson that Marx drew through the First International, the combination of social with political action, because, and not despite of, their mutual contradiction, stood as a legacy to be appropriated by a later generation. As he proclaimed as early as the inaugural address of 1864, if the emancipation of the working classes requires their fraternal concurrence, how are they to fulfill that great mission with a foreign policy in pursuit of criminal designs, playing upon national prejudices, and squandering in piratical wars the people's blood and treasure? It was not the wisdom of the ruling classes, but the heroic resistance to their criminal folly by the working classes of England that saved the West of Europe from plunging headlong into an infamous crusade for the perpetuation and propagation of slavery on the other side of the Atlantic. Ultimately, socialism could only be won through an international dictatorship of the proletariat, and this was the legacy of the First International.
So I'm going to talk about the prehistory of the Second International in America, dealing with the First International in the United States. That's my task. After the dissolution of Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party in the late 1820s, Jeffersonian politics split. Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren's party deployed Jefferson's legacy to build a new form of democratic politics, capital D, where the productive activity of the farmer and artisan took ideological primacy over commercial and financial expansion. However, Jackson's true political ingenuity was his ability to present himself as the representative of Western farmers, urban artisans, all the while remaining faithful to Southern planters. Jefferson's party had strongly supported protectionist tariffs to encourage domestic manufacturing, but these were no longer politically viable if Democrats hoped to retain their base among cotton-growing Southern planters. Appealing to northern artisans and western farmers, Jackson's Democrats eliminated property requirements for voting and political office, while also promising greater access to land. The political program of greater democratization thus helped maintain a tacit alliance between small farmers, urban laborers, and slaveholders under the leadership of the Democratic Party. On the other side of the split were Northern Jeffersonians and Painites, after Thomas Paine, champions of free labor and leaders of the shorter hours movement. The split in Jeffersonian politics deepened in the political crises of the Mexican-American War, America's 1848, when liberals were forced to confront the future of the Republic. Would America extend the empire of liberty, or would the Republic establish the hemisphere for slavery? Would the war, as Horace Greeley wrote, force the world to recede towards the midnight of barbarism? This is how the crisis of liberalism presented itself in the United States. During and after the defeats of the 1848 revolutions, the American Republic, once again as it had in the 18th century, served as a shelter for a new generation of revolutionaries. This has led some historians to label the arrival of socialist political ideas as a foreign importation, at odds with the so-called American Reform tradition. But the story is a lot more cosmopolitan than this narrative conveys. Throughout the late 18th and 19th centuries, Europe's Republicans promoted the ideals of the transatlantic republic as their own. They drew from the egalitarian values of the rights of man, the Declaration of Independence, and the early American Painite societies. German reformers wrote biographies of the founding fathers. British Chartists incorporated the American flag as a guiding symbol in their meetings, and trade union leaders and socialists in London doubled down against the affront on free labor during the American Civil War by founding the International Workingmen's Association. Once revolutionaries and reformers landed in the United States, they thus brought back to Americans concerns about the future of liberty, which had their origins in the Republic's founding. In the early fights for a shorter working day in the United States, for example, the Chartist expat John Clure, a leader in New England circles, called for a second independence among American working men. And in the American Civil War, 1/10 of the entire Union Army were German-born. No wonder then that once the First International reached the United States in 1869, 4 out of the 7 New York City labor unions were German. So needless to say that the so-called German problem in America was a fundamentally American problem, since it displays one of the main features of the United States as a nation of nations, that is, as the site of the World Republic. The founding of the First International in London, 1864, coincided with the rise in trade union activity in the 1860s, in both in the US and in Europe. The first enduring nationwide labor organization in the United States was founded in 1866, the National Labor Union, which the International called, quote, the most advanced practical advocates of the rights of labor in America. The NLU had a peak membership of about 300,000, among them the first international leader and Baden revolutionary Friedrich Sorge. In London, the General Council followed the activities of the NLU and established lines of communication with officers William Silvis, the president of the Iron Molders International Union and a tireless advocate for the 8-hour day, and William Jessup, the corresponding secretary for the most powerful trade union body in the country, New York City's Working Men's Union. Silvis had established a common alliance with the Lasallians in the National Labor Congress of 1867, so Lasallians in America, when he introduced a resolution calling for the US Congress to appropriate $25 million to aid in establishing the 8-hour system. He defended the proposal against criticism with the support of several German members. During the following year, he called for the establishment of a federal Department of Labor to distribute public land, regulate trade unions, and promote cooperatives. When members challenged this motion, Silvis argued in favor of the Lasallian model. In Prussia, they have a labor department, presided over by one of the ablest men of the day. The working class has the arm of government around it, and they are properly protected, end quote. For both LaSalle and Silvis, the people's state was a permanent feature of a liberated society. The official affiliation of the NLU and the International was cut short, in part due to the sudden death of Silvis. Outside of the NLU, the International lacked deep connections with trade union circles in the US that it had in England. American efforts leaned heavily on the German 48ers, Friedrich Sorge and Siegfried Meyer. German immigrants made up about half of the total membership of the International in the US, and in 1869, Sorge became the spirited leader of the first section in America. In addition to members from the now defunct Communist Club, Sorge and Meyer sought to bring together LaSallians, former members of the General German Workers Association, as well as the anti-LaSallians from the Die Arbeiter Union. While this period of social democratic unity among the German immigrants had formed the basis for Section 1 in 1870, the Franco-Prussian War split the immigrants, as many of its members defended Bismarck's war on the basis of national unification. So by publicly opposing the war, the International in the US lost its connection to the larger German workers' movement. This turn of events, combined with the decline of the NLU in the 1870s, meant that the International found itself isolated from its ideal audience, the American working class, both English and German-speaking members. The mass anti-war meeting did, however, significantly raise its profile among American-born citizens and incited curiosity from veteran land reformers, communalist, and free love radicals who were also in attendance at Cooper Union's anti-war demonstration. In the months that followed, many of them joined the International as the new English-speaking sections. The American English-speaking faction, which eventually battled Sorge for leadership of the International, was spearheaded by prominent Republican reformers William West and Victoria Woodhull, whose departure from the North American Central Committee resulted in the formation of two rival federal councils on November 1871. Note the year. Woodhull was an early supporter for women's rights, a spiritualist and free lover, who gave the opposition its voice on the pages of her paper, Woodhull and Claflin Weekly, the first newspaper in the United States to print the English translation of Marx's Communist Manifesto. The ideological tensions within the United States sections grew from arguments over the meaning of the Social Republic of Labor. The American split was shaped by the aftermath of the Paris Commune in 1871. While the Commune took the International from relative obscurity into mass notoriety, it also exacerbated tensions among the General Council in London, the leading body of the organization. Its vigorous campaign for the recognition of the Commune prompted the first break in the leadership, with two members stepping down from the council after the publication of Marx's third address on the Civil War in France, which had been originally commissioned by its leadership. Among London's leaders, the old Chartist and influential trade unionist George Odger sided with liberal reformer Charles Bradlaugh in a quote-unquote Republican campaign supporting the Versailles Republic against the communards. So it was this break over the Commune which was at the center of the International's demise. And although the disagreements with labor Republicans in England was an ocean away, the American strife between Woodhull's section and Sorge's faction originated from a similar predicament. That is, from a fundamental ambivalence towards forging the independent political power of labor in a country where working men had the vote. In her newspaper, Woodhull defended the Democratic Republic against the social revolution and argued that working men should deploy the power of the almighty ballot against the monopolist in power. The fault, she argued, quote, lies in the Constitution and the laws of the country which allow for such a usurpation of power to take place. The American faction thus echoed the early Chartist formulations about constitutional change and representational justice in government, which had been opposed by London radicals like Joseph Harney, Marx and Engels' associate, in the 1830s and 40s. Woodhull's faction published an appeal in the newspaper where they argued that the primary task of the International was the expansion of political participation so that all citizens could take part in, quote, the preparation, the administration, and execution of the law by which all are governed, which would justly deliver industry back to the people through the state under a so-called new government. In correspondence with Sorge, Friedrich Engels wrote that it was not the task of the International to shift the foundations of the existing state, but rather to exploit it, end quote. The International should not perfect the democratic republic, but abolish the external compulsion of capital on political action. The International, argued Sorge, is and ought to be a working men's organization and nothing else. He called on the General Council to introduce a resolution which would admit new sections only when at least 2/3 of their members are wage laborers, resulting in a minority of middle-class reformers in each section. When Sorge's faction unfavorably compared middle-class to working-class reforms, they were making a political judgment, not a sociological one. The distinction lay in whether or not reforms advance the democratic control of industry by working men. Middle-class reforms would make capitalist class rule more inclusive at the expense of labor's political independence. These were the lessons of 1848, a return to the problem of Bonapartism. A worker state, as Marx wrote of the Paris Commune for the General Council, was, quote, the political form under which to work out the economical emancipation of labor. The original mandate for the International was for working men to conquer political power in order to lead the democratic discontent in society. While in the first years of the organization, this mission remained purely theoretical, the Paris Commune brought latent disagreements in the General Council to the forefront. So the International split both in America and in England on this critical point. So after the International disbanded in July of 1876, by this time the headquarters had been moved to New York City in an attempt to let the International die in peace away from the controversy of Bakunin. By then, it was a shell of its former self. Sorge continued his fight well into the late 1870s. When the Marxists in America slowly won over the Lassallians and the two sides reconciled on principles similar to the ones that united the two groups back in Germany at the Gotha Congress of 1875. But this unity was short-lived. Sorge, along with the former Irish Secretary of the International, J.P. MacDonald, broke off from the Lassallians. They left the joint venture of the Working Men's Party of the United States because the Lassallians successfully pushed for electoral collaboration with the Greenback Labor Party. So Sorge and his supporters joined the American 8-hour day reformers, Ira Stewart and George McNeil, a key organizer in the Knights of Labor. Together, they founded the International Labor Union, an organization of all working men under a national and international amalgamation of all labor unions. So clearly this was a concession, a step backwards from the calls for political power, which were at the forefront of the inaugural address. Perhaps a step back in order to move forward. Amidst the political decline after the International, Sorge, along with Marx, regarded Stewart's ideas as, quote, an oasis in the desert of currency reform humbug, which had overtaken the Lassallians. Stewart and McNeil were especially taken by a copy of Marx's Capital. After reading it, Stewart had nothing but praise for the chapter on the working day and wrote to Sorge that he wanted this translation of Karl Marx to be read. He found a common ally in Sorge, and in his correspondence, he wrote that the Lassallian opposition, which Friedrich Sorge had been facing all these years, was, as he put it, quote, made up of the same middle-class reformers that he'd been fighting for the past 10 years in New England. So it was the same problem, just the German kind.
In January of this year, I gave a teach-in at our Northwestern chapter that was titled Debs-era Socialism in Rearview Mirror. In the first part of that teach-in, I tried to paint a general picture of the Socialist Party of America, or SPA, during the lifetime of Eugene Debs, and to offer a framework for understanding the party's crises, eclipse, and suppression. Here I stress the importance of the party's relationship to capitalist progressivism. In the second part of that teach-in, I treated the left's historical consciousness, specifically its historical memory of Debsian socialism, as a collection of symptoms registering the decline of the left over the course of the 20th century. I would encourage those of you interested in this topic to watch that teach-in on YouTube. On this panel, I want to do something different. I want to bridge the Marxism of the American left in the 19th century to the Marxism of the Socialist Party of America at the dawn of the 20th century. In his 1952 book, Marxian Socialism in the United States, the sociologist Daniel Bell portrays the competing approaches to labor organizing and to party politics that populated the fractious landscape of the late 19th century American left. For Bell, this era was characterized by an antinomy between purism and pure and simple. That is, between the purist Marxist sectarianism of Daniel de Leon, who led the Socialist Labor Party, and the pure and simple trade unionism of Samuel Gompers, who led the American Federation of Labor. Between these two extremes, Bell argues that the formation of a political party, like the British Labour Party, would have represented the proper middle ground. From this vantage point, Bell laments that the Socialist Party of America ultimately fell, in his view, in its opposition to the First World War on the purist side of the scale, abjuring the role of junior partner in capitalist state governance in favor of fidelity to its utopian Marxist politics. We can admit the antinomy Bell presents here without conceding the political conclusion Bell draws from it. For in its founding 1901 moment, the Socialist Party of America did indeed represent a profound mediation of this antinomy. On the one side of the antinomy stood Samuel Gompers and the American Federation of Labor, or AFL. Bell narrates Gompers' rise as follows. When Gompers was 23, he went to work in the cigar shop of David Hirsch, a German revolutionary exile whose factory was the center of many burning theoretical controversies. In the shop, Gompers came under the influence of Karl Ferdinand Laurel, an ardent Marxist who had been active in the First International. Marxism then meant, however, a fierce trade unionism, as against the political biases of the Lassalleans, and Gompers was quickly won to the trade union viewpoint. The obstinate manner in which the sectarian political socialists ignored the bread and butter concerns of the union soured Gompers and other trade unionists on political socialism. It was Gompers' early Marxism qua economism, Bell suggests, that underlay Gompers' mature political philosophy of quote-unquote voluntarism. Bell describes Gompers' voluntarism as a fear of the state akin to Manchester liberalism. Gompers opposed unemployment insurance, for example, for fear that it would render workers dependent on the state and on political parties rather than on unions and on workers' associations. Gompers eventually opposed laws to limit the hours of the working day because he thought such laws would only serve to empower the courts, while setting a de facto floor, rather than a real ceiling, on the hours which unions could win from their employers. Even when, in 1900, Gompers co-founded the National Civic Federation, a tripartite body of business, labor, and state leaders aimed at ameliorating labor conflicts, he viewed this not as a collaboration between labor and the state, but one between labor and capital. Gompers' fear of the state was only partial and selective, however. Bell's narration of Gompers' early life continues as follows. Gompers' Cigar Makers Union faced competition from cheap, low-paid home workers who made the cigars in their tenement homes. Gompers, as the head of the union, sought legislation outlawing the production of cigars in homes. He marked for reprisal those legislators who voted against the measure and called for support of those who worked for the bill. These legislators were running on old-line party tickets, capitalist political parties. But the political socialists were dead set against voting for old party candidates, even the pro-labor ones, charging that such a move might provide temporary gains for the cigar makers, but at the expense of corrupting the labor movement and destroying political socialism. Here we see a logic consistent with Gompers' support for state restrictions on Chinese immigration, with the AFL union's close relationships with the ward heelers of the Democratic Party's Tammany Hall, and with Gompers's eventual embrace in 1916 of Woodrow Wilson's military preparedness initiatives. In this last instance, Gompers was inspired by the benefits labor had won through partnership with the state in Britain during wartime. If, quote, the way out of the wage system is through higher wages, as Gompers quipped in 1891, then this way might well run through partnerships with capitalist political parties and with the capitalist state. On the other side of Daniel Bell's antinomy stood Daniel de Leon and the Socialist Labor Party, or SLP. In 1888, Engels, in a letter to Sorge, derided the SLP as a catch basin for theoretically confused refugees from Germany's anti-socialist laws. But in the years that followed, the SLP recruited talented organizers and intellectuals among New York's Eastern European immigrants, among them Morris Hillquit of the United Hebrew Trades. De Leon joined the party in 1890 and assumed leadership in 1891. De Leon attempted without success to capture leadership of both the growing AFL and the declining Knights of Labor. He came to believe that the leaders of these unions controlled their rank and file in a machine-like fashion and thereby prevented socialist unionists from conducting propaganda and recruiting to the party among union members. He therefore created a new labor organization, the Socialist Trades and Labor Alliance, or STLA, that was explicitly affiliated with the SLP and its program. The STLA set up rival unions in AFL shops, including in Gompers's own cigar makers union. Using Marx as his warrant, de Leon argued that it was futile for unions to struggle for higher wages and shorter hours within capitalism. He argued that immediate demands would only corrupt a socialist political party's platform. And he argued that capitalism would inevitably absorb labor leaders as its quote-unquote labor lieutenants, a phrase for which de Leon became famous. This left propagandistic electoral campaigns and socialist education as the only tactics available to de Leon's party and his unions. A theoretical visionary, de Leon stressed the need to organize workers along industry-wide lines as a necessary condition for a Soviet-type government of representation by trades. In de Leon's hands, however, this platform only proved, as Engels wrote to Sorge in 1891, quote, how useless is a platform, for the most part theoretically correct, if it is unable to get into contact with the actual needs of the people. Indeed, SLP membership never topped 6,000, and over the course of the 1890s, the party declined. It failed to recruit new unions and lost many of the 100 unions it initially commanded. Perhaps most significantly, the SLP alienated socialist unionists within the AFL, who had initially hoped, only to be bitterly disappointed, that the mission of de Leon's STLA would be to organize the unorganized, rather than to establish rival dual unions in the AFL's own shops. The Marxian socialists who founded and led the SPA represented, both individually and together, a political intervention aimed at mediating the antinomy described above. Their politics contained key elements of the perspectives of both Gompers and de Leon, while transcending the political limitations of each man's approach. Like Gompers, and unlike de Leon, the socialists who founded the SPA thought that labor unions should struggle to improve workers' wages and conditions, and that a socialist party should support unions in this task. The SPA's founders thought that labor unions need not and should not explicitly affiliate with political parties, however, or themselves become political bodies. And they opposed the formation of rival unions in a single shop for this purpose, generally speaking. Some SPA leaders, like Victor Berger and Morris Hillquit, even shared Gompers's orientation to craft unions of skilled workers, and they minimized the need to organize the unorganized. The SPA's leaders, likewise, like Gompers, opposed attempts by AFL unionists to form a labor party. Unlike Gompers, though, the SPA's leaders thought that socialist unionists should spread socialist ideas and recruit party members among the AFL rank and file, and should make every effort to steer their unions away from dealings with the capitalist parties. Additionally, like de Leon, and unlike Gompers, the SPA's leaders reserved their political support for exclusively socialist political parties, and never, at least until 1924, supported capitalist or petit bourgeois political parties of any kind. SPA leaders Eugene Debs and Bill Haywood even shared de Leon's vision of organizing workers along industry-wide lines, and they denounced Gompers for his unwillingness to organize the unorganized. This is not to say that the SPA resolved the antinomy between sectarianism and economism, between purism and pure and simple. Indeed, the internal controversies of the SPA during the lifetime of Eugene Debs can all be read as symptoms of the party's success in deepening that contradiction. At the dawn of the 20th century, this is how Marxism in America had advanced from the 19th.
So the title of my talk is Gilded Age Socialism, Historically Past. You'll have to forgive me because I was unable to print it. One of the reasons why I was late. I also have to read it off the phone. The great question regarding Marxism today is whether it is still current or rather belongs to the past. Was Marxism in its highest moment confined to its contemporary period of the Second Industrial Revolution, to the industrialization of the United States after the Civil War, which took place contemporaneously with that of the other countries where the Second Industrial Revolution was centered, namely Germany, Japan, Italy, and Russia, where Marxism also, as in the United States, had its greatest influence over the socialist movement. By Marxism, I mean, of course, not the theory of Karl Marx, but rather proletarian socialist politics in the historically Marxist mold, which combines social and political action, economic and political struggle, as opposed to other forms of socialism. The question before us today on this panel is that of the historical legacy, is that of the historical Socialist Party of America, member of the Second or Socialist International, and led by Marxists such as Eugene Debs, its most prominent public political figure. Was the SPA a phenomenon specific to the era of the rapid industrialization of the United States, the Gilded Age between the Civil War and World War I? For the SPA did not really survive the war in its aftermath, split as it was into the new Communist Party of the Third or Communist International, and repressed by the government both during the war and afterwards in the notorious Palmer raids. I'm going to deliberately place certain blinders on my consideration, namely confining my history to specifically American socialism. In so doing, I'm going to have to ignore some glaring omissions, for instance, leaving aside the Russian Revolution and the subsequent history of Soviet communism and Stalinism. That being said, the long legacy of the SPA is found today in such phenomena as First Amendment freedom of speech and association disputes contra public safety, as in the expression that one cannot yell fire in a crowded theater, which dates back to the suppression of the SPA, as Debs's vocal opposition to the war was the supposed threat to public safety not protected by the First Amendment, according to the Supreme Court. The SPA's members had previously established the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, as well as having established the NAACP, the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People. The issue then is the relationship between the Socialist Party and progressivism. For the latter, eclipsed socialism in the United States, starting with Woodrow Wilson's election in 1912 and culminating in FDR's election in 1932 and New Deal reforms implemented in the 1930s that flipped the US political party system and replaced the prior ruling Republican Party since the Civil War with the Democrats as the progressive liberal party. This latter change was so profound that it has been regarded as a third American Revolution after the original and the Civil War. It is significant that the SPA peaked in 1912, when it so happens that the SPD in Germany also peaked. And progressivism replaced it since then, namely replacing the struggle for socialism with the reform of capitalism. As I have written in The End of Millennial Marxism, historically, workers have engaged in new organizing efforts with each successive wave of capitalist development, motivated by transformed conditions created by new industries. Socialist Party leader Eugene Debs, for instance, had his formative experience in the 1894 Pullman strike, which took place in the era of the rapid expansion of American railroads. We might observe that the wave of worker militancy and socialist organizing that made Marxism into a mass political movement took place around the world in the wake of the 1893 panic. This led to the growth and development of the SPD in Germany and led to the birth of the Labour Party in the UK and the SPA in the United States. It also created the conditions for the formation of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party of Lenin. In capitalism, great economic depressions, nowadays called recessions, have not brought an end to capitalism, but rather to its reinvigoration. Capitalism reproduces itself through crises and resulting regeneration. Capitalism is reconstituted through its self-destruction. Working class movements are part of this process. The question then is how this could lead to socialism instead of rebooting capitalism. What is peculiar is how, although capitalism has experienced countless business cycles of boom and bust in the last 200 years, only one era saw the emergence and blooming of Marxism as a mass movement in the advanced capitalist countries, namely the historical period in question, that of the Second Industrial Revolution Gilded Age, or roughly the 50 years between 1870 and 1920, scarcely 2 generations in time. These 2 generations, those of August Bebel, Wilhelm Liebknecht, Karl Kautsky, Eduard Bernstein, Georgy Plekhanov, and Eugene Debs on the one hand, and Vladimir Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, and Leon Trotsky on the other, brought the Marxist movement into existence and experienced its historical crisis and downfall. What we are concerned with here is the potential reproduction of such an achievement in our time, or for our time, or at least at some point in the foreseeable future. Is there a future for Marxism? So the question hinges on conditions for social mobilization and political radicalization, how to build a revolutionary movement. Unfortunately, many misconceptions abound regarding what that even means, what a revolutionary movement fundamentally is. These misconceptions have their basis in distortions of memory, how the history is misremembered, subject to a selective reduction in hindsight. There are 2 questions. How did workers become radicalized? And how did intellectuals become revolutionaries? For normally, workers, like everyone else, are not especially radical under capitalism, and intellectuals serve not to change, but preserve the status quo. In both cases, we are concerned with workers and intellectuals becoming socialists. Workers might be mobilized in capitalist politics, and intellectuals might contribute to change, but within the overall maintenance of capitalism. Capitalist politics plays a role in the periodic crises and waves of destruction and reproduction in capitalism. Is there a specifically socialist as opposed to capitalist way that workers and intellectuals might take part in these cycles of history? In certain respects, the period 1870 to 1920 was the first and remains the only time that the subaltern have constituted a mass social and political movement, and not been merely the followers of those already dominant in society. Certainly, it was the period of its greatest extent in the advanced capitalist countries. What made this period so unique? Was it contingent and unrepeatable, or was there something of this time that continues in its essence today? I've already mentioned the succession of progressive liberal capitalist politics over socialism at the end of this historical era. How did progressivism succeed over socialism? Was socialism a variety of progressivism, but just an inferior or antiquated one? I would offer that we still live with the consequences of the failure of Marxism, and with the continuing effects of how that failure was institutionalized in progressive capitalist policy and politics. Progressivism has provided a successful way of managing capitalism as a substitute for socialism, although lately it seems to have itself reached certain limits. Insofar as it has succeeded economically, politically, and socially, progressivism has made the struggle for socialism redundant or unnecessary, and considering the great effort required for the latter, undesirable, if not impossible. We have experienced now 2 waves of progressivism, those of the early and late 20th centuries, or, in terms more familiar to Platypus, of the 1930s old left and the 1960s new left. In both cases, the struggle for socialism was replaced by capitalist reforms. Today, we are facing the limits of the progressive capitalist reforms instituted in the wake of the New Left, namely neoliberalism. We are also apparently facing the limits of the progressive capitalist reforms that were instituted in the era of the Old Left in response to the Great Depression, the welfare state. Intellectuals in our time, the millennial left, have harked back first to the Old Left reforms and more recently to the New Left reforms, hoping to rejuvenate them. What has been forgotten in capitalism, but rather to socialism, at least in the minds of the original old and new leftists of the 20th century. In this way, socialism has been confused and mistaken for the reform of capitalism. In this way, the dialectical relationship between capitalism and socialism has been misapprehended. An example to help illustrate how this has functioned can be found in the history of the labor movement that is related but not identical with, and at some distance from, the history of socialist politics. The American Federation of Labor, or AFL, was led by Samuel Gompers, who was a socialist educated in his perspective by Marxists. Eugene Debs had a famous conflict and contest with Gompers over the direction and character of the labor movement, with Gompers representing older craft-based trade unionism and Debs representing a newer perspective of industrial unionism. Eventually, this led Debs, with other socialists, to found the IWW, Industrial Workers of the World. Related to this was Gompers' preference for supporting progressivism in the Democratic Party instead of Debs' Socialist Party. Later, after Debs and Gompers' time, industrial unionism was accomplished by the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or CIO, with leading participation by socialists of a variety of ideological tendencies, including the Communist Party, which filled the new needs of labor organizing neglected by the old AFL. Eventually, the AFL and CIO merged, and they are now a key constituency of the Democratic Party. But the older craft trade unionism was radical for its time. It was led by socialists and even Marxists, as was industrial unionism. But both became not movements leading beyond capitalism, but rather institutions within and part of capitalism. There was an upsurge of labor militancy and organizing in the 1960s and 1970s, but it did not transform the existing labor unions nor produce a new form of unionization as might have been required by the new form of capitalism that emerged at that time, what we now call neoliberalism, namely the more service-based and decentralized form of work, at least as compared to the older. What prevented the last major wave of new capitalism from producing new forms of labor organizing, as well as new forms of socialist politics? One could say that the surviving legacy organizations and political parties stood in the way of meeting the challenge and achieving this. What is remarkable about our time then is the test to which the existing political parties and civil social organizations are being subject in the latest crisis of capitalism. Unlike the 1960s and 70s, the existing formations seem unable to meet the new needs in however minimal ways. This is what makes the millennial capitulation to the Democratic Party so painful to witness. It was so unnecessary, but there was evidently a significant lack of imagination, filled, however, spuriously by the haunting ghosts of past leftism. There was a sense of an old need being presented anew, but it was ill-defined. The lack of clarity was precisely over the meaning of socialism and Marxism, for which the millennials reached back. They became subject and beholden to the confusion and mistakes of their ancestors. Perhaps it is inevitable that the past should be recalled and rehearsed, but the question is, which past and how? It is specifically tragic that the past that was remembered was not the Socialist Party of Eugene Debs and the Second International, but rather Great Depression-era Communist Party of Stalin and the Comintern and the New Left of the 1960s and 70s. The millennials could only imagine emancipation as expansion of the welfare state and of identity politics. They could only imagine more Democratic Party policies. There are failures and there are failures. Not all are equal in significance or poignancy in their tragedy. The 1930s and 60s were much lesser failures than that of the original historical Marxism. And worse still, the 1930s and 60s are misremembered not as failures, but as successes, not as tragedies, but as heroism, forgetting that what makes heroes tragic is their tragedy. The question is what results from the tragedy. What is the lesson to be learned in the cosmic story that is told? The story at this point is the history of capitalism. What is the lesson to be learned from the history of socialism? What was the purpose of that struggle? Was it to reform capitalism or to get beyond it? That is the question that we are faced with today. It is clear in hindsight that, unlike the original era of Marxism at the turn of the 20th century, both the 1930s and 1960s lacked dedication and belief in overcoming capitalism, at least not directly. Now that we are reaching the exhaustion of the capitalist reforms born from those times, we might be haunted rather from that earlier time, which was so much more hopeful and organized, but which bequeathed us no significant reform of capitalism. Nothing to be confused with and mistaken for socialism. The old socialism accomplished nothing, not even to change capitalism. It is this that might be its redeeming virtue.
So I wanted to give the panelists an opportunity to respond to each other. You each have about 2 minutes or so. We'll just go in the order that you guys spoke.
Yeah, I guess the question that occurred to me when I was listening to Pam is I think I glossed over a great deal in the pre-1848 history. And I was wondering, to what extent you find the roots of American socialism in the debates over the Mexican-American War, right? Was Engels naive about his sort of optimism about that war? Was he out of touch with American debates at that time? With respect to Ed's presentation, I think that the question that I would want to put a finer point on is how Reconstruction and the period, how the defeat of Reconstruction and the end of radical republicanism conditions the rise of American socialism. Like, how would you directly narrate that, right? And with respect to Chris, I think that in some ways, I guess I would ask the way in which the way that he just concluded in talking about socialism, American socialism, not really contributing to American capitalism, not really reforming American capitalism, and that is being its virtue. How he would view the earlier 19th century in those terms. That, what would it mean to think of the American Revolution and the American Civil War as not actually the conception or seed time of American capitalism. Right, but in that sense, rather something more like an unredeemed legacy.
On the question of the Mexican-American War, I mean, I think that it had a sort of forward-looking character and then a backward-looking one, which is that the northern circles around the what were the working men parties, so the Ricardian socialist intervention in the United States, these critics, these Jeffersonians in the North, they felt like their job was to organize against the expansion of slavery. So it gave them this boost. At the same time, they had to find, in the same way that, you know, in London this was the case, or in England it was the case, a common cause with those who they had begun to critique, kind of liberal northern leaders. And so, right, so it was forward-looking, but backward-looking in terms of defining a class politics. I wanted to raise the question for Chris about the kind of Marxist intervention. So you were asking, is socialism simply a lesser or inadequate progressivism, and that Marxism is a kind of critique within socialist politics, right? Like, was a way of raising that question historically. And in the past years, within Platypus's own conception of the socialist turn within our organization of putting like the question of socialism forward, one of the things that was emphasized is that you can't really have a Marxist critique, a Marxist intervention, without this object of critique called socialist politics. And so what would allow for a recrudescence of the question of Marxism today, given the absence of that?
Thanks, Spencer. I'm not sure that I can entirely adequately answer the question, but a few thoughts come to mind. One is that I believe it wasn't until 1912 that the Socialist Party of America had full sort of state chapters, state organizations in all of the states of the Union. And the Deep South proved, as far as I understand, the very most difficult region for the party to organize. The party was actually very strong in the western South, like parts of Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, but relatively weak in the South compared to all other regions. As a legacy, I would say, broadly speaking, of the failure and defeat of Reconstruction that was still with the party as of the 1900s. There's a dissertation about the party's activities in the South that I haven't read, but they were able to organize something there, but it was difficult compared to the rest of the country. The second thought that comes to mind is that I believe as late as the late 1860s, there are labor organizers thinking about the political expression of the labor movement who are shocked that some socialists and others would consider a party other than the Republican Party. But of course, this changes. And I'm not really familiar with exactly when and why, but that is a kind of watershed, I think, the Reconstruction period.
I was going to say, in terms of the questions that you guys raised regarding my presentation, it's really the issue of socialism and liberalism. And so, you know, this would be a kind of an anachronistic way of putting it, but I nonetheless will put it this way, that the Republican Party was the progressive liberal party before FDR. And that's what flipped. So what you have in the United States with the capitalist political parties are the two parties. One is the progressive liberal party and the other is the conservative liberal party. So it's basically a split within liberalism. So what's the relationship between socialism and progressive liberalism and conservative liberalism? Because in fact, one of the things that makes this history so difficult to navigate is that socialism is going to look like it's on both sides of the split in liberalism that takes place in capitalism. And so in that respect, in response to Spencer's question about the American Revolution and the Civil War as legacies for socialism rather than legacies just of capitalism, it goes to this point, namely that liberalism has two histories. It has the history of the American Revolution, and it has the history of the Civil War. Right, those are the two great accomplishments of liberalism in American history. Now, to Pam's question of without an object of critique, right? So one of the things that we've done in Platypus over a number of years now, really over 12 years, ever since I wrote my piece and presented at the Left Forum on Lenin's liberalism, and I also presented it at the convention of that year. There is this question of, is Marxism not only a self-criticism of socialism, but also a self-criticism of liberalism? So behind the question of someone like Lenin's liberalism or historical Marxism's liberalism is the question of Marx's own liberalism. And this sort of haunts the Marxology in terms of, when did Marx change? When did he go from being a liberal to being a socialist? What year did that happen? Well, of course, he never did, right? He never gave up being a liberal in becoming a socialist. So, you know, of course I'm very aware, that this language of liberalism is very unfamiliar, and generally the left only has scorn and contempt for liberals, right? Like, liberalism is like a dirty word, it's a bad word. Even in Marx's own mouth, he excoriates the liberals. He excoriates the we might say the small L liberals, the French liberals, and the capital L liberals, namely the British Liberal Party. So why and how is that the case? It's not the case that the liberals are the capitalists. There are in the 19th century and there are in the 20th century. So the Labour Party in the UK simply replaced the Liberal Party. That's what happened. And it became the Liberal Party. It became the Progressive Liberal Party as opposed to the Conservative Liberal Party. Now, of course, in Britain, you have the Tories, quote unquote Tories, right? You have the Conservatives. But of course, the Conservatives are not like feudal monarchist throwbacks. They're conservative liberals, right? The whole nomenclature, the Tory, that's just a derogation. They're conservative liberals. So the history is not also very different. And indeed, what was just mentioned, the gravitation in the 19th century for socialists was towards the liberals in Britain and towards the Republican Party in the United States. Towards the history of the Whigs, so one thing that, one little minor criticism that I have of you, Pam, is that you leave a lot unsaid. So you should have mentioned the greenback connection to the currency humbug, and you should have mentioned when the Democrats split, the Democratic Republicans, when the Jeffersonian Party split, that it split into the Democrats and the Whigs. And the Whigs later split and became the Republicans. Right, so what was that split about? What was the progressive versus the conservative wing of that split? And where were the workers and the socialists with regard to that history? Because again, you can trace it through. So in fact, the whole question of proletarian socialism, socialism in the era of the Industrial Revolution, namely socialism per se, has always been this relationship with liberalism and with progressive liberalism, even when we didn't have that language to describe it. Like I said, I'm speaking somewhat anachronistically. Progressivism is a term that's really from the late 19th century. So I think that that's really the issue, and of course, it's the enduring issue in capitalist politics today. What is the relationship of socialists, or wannabe socialists, to liberalism as the form of capitalist politics?
Okay, at this point, I'd like to draw the audience's attention to a microphone that's located to the right and in the front of the room. Because of the tech situation, you'll have to line up here to ask some questions, but I wanted to open up the discussion to the audience. So please, so please line up.
You don't have a wireless mic, huh?
I guess not, yeah.
You Chicago is stuck in the Stone Age.
It's on all Rush.
I know you needed a male-to-male USB. I was
Yeah.
like, who doesn't have that?
You should probably, I guess.
Yeah. So you have to bring your own cables. Is it the thing?
So this is sort of an open question, but to what extent did the William Jennings Bryan populist movement subvert socialism and socialist politics in the early 20th and late 19th century?
I could just make one initial determination of that, which is that Debs, of course, was around the populists and then split with them. Right, so the nature of that split really has to do with, again, the conversion to Marxism. Meaning, I don't think that that split would have been as easily effectuated if Debs had not been exposed to Marxism. So what did that do? Right, so if we normally think of Marxism as like emphasis on class, right? Like this is, everyone will say, well, you can't ever throw out Marx because Marx reminds us that class exists, as if we need Marx to tell us that. But an analysis of the politics, in other words, what is William Jennings Bryan? What is populism? And of course, we have the indelible phrase that Debs used to describe the Democratic Party in 1900 when Bryan was no longer an independent populist but had become the Democratic Party presidential candidate. Namely, the Democrats represent the wail and cry of the dying middle class, as opposed to the working class, right? As opposed to the working class. So the working class can join in the wail and cry of the dying middle class. So every wave of capitalism does destroy the existing concrete working class. And insofar as the working class has a vested interest in capitalism, it can easily become part of that so-called middle class. It can be the petite bourgeoisie as opposed to the haute bourgeoisie. It can be the people at the bottom of bourgeois society as opposed to the people at the top of bourgeois society, because there's really a difference between thinking about like workers and capitalists. That's a different definition than petty bourgeois and haute bourgeois. The workers can be petty bourgeois, and they often are. So the real issue is then, what was the nature of populism's complaint against capitalism? What's the nature of the complaint? And what's the nature of the opposition to the Republican Party as the capitalist party, which was nonetheless also the progressive liberal party? And we have some so William Jennings Bryan, he's an interesting one, isn't he? He's famous later. So he was Secretary of State in the Woodrow Wilson administration, and then even later, he's famous for, do you guys know?
Scopes trial.
The Scopes trial, right? Defending Christianity against Darwinian evolution. Ha ha! That should tell you something, shouldn't it? About this populism. It's reactionary. It always was. So William Jennings Bryan, goes down in history as like a liberal, like kind of progressive reformer. He's an anti-imperialist. Isn't that good? Isn't it good to be anti-imperialist? But again, the question raised by Debs is, why are you opposed to imperialism? What basis? What basis? And Debs is very frank. He said, look, the workers are, in some ways, more naturally on the side of capitalist development, right? And yet also oppose imperialism, but impose it differently, oppose finance capital, not just overseas empire, oppose monopoly, oppose the collusion of the state with the capitalist class, differently than the middle class does, than the populists did, than the Democrats did, and do.
Chris, if I could just add on to that, maybe this, is it on now? And why this doesn't speak directly to your question, but rather where Chris ended just before we began the Q&A and now, which is this issue of liberalism. as you guys know, I've just done a lot of work on this, and the point to, I sometimes think that people in, Marxists think that the Marxian critique of Bonapartism or imperialism comes from Marx. It does not. It comes from liberals. And it's a widespread preoccupation amongst liberals. They register this, and of course, Marx is, as I tried to point out, relentlessly unoriginal. And it also gets to this question that I think anticipates the kind of comments that Chris just made about Debs's comments on the Republican Party, which is, and I indicated this in my remarks, but I wanted to underscore it, which is the formation of the Liberal Party in 1859 is the object of critique in a British context for the formation of the First International. Gladstone and Palmerston are trying to maneuver Britain into war with the Union, the Liberal Party being formed in 1859. And the people who Marx himself is helping to organize to, as millennials would say, platform, is John Bright, right, the great Manchester liberal, right, as Chris would put it, the haute bourgeoisie, right. It is the capitalists, the spokesperson for the capitalist class, that is being placed on the platform as the lead speaker for opposition to the British government's attempt to recognize the Confederacy. Right, so at the heart of the formation of the First International, Marx is acknowledging is the struggle with liberalism in the sense of the spokespeople for capital, right? And actually, John, in those meetings in London.
Do you want to talk about populist stuff?
Sure.
We have a lot, and we don't have
Yeah,
much time.
just briefly on this, because I think it might be important. I would really not put it as a matter of Bryan's populism subverting the SPA. I think, if anything, it would be the progressivism of the period that ultimately eclipses the SPA. Arguably, this is a bold and polemical way of putting it, but if progressivism didn't exist as a political tendency within capitalism, there might still be the Debsian Socialist Party today. Because ultimately, it's not populism that's a kind of fatal threat to the party in any meaningful way. In fact, the Democratic Party absorbs Bryan and a big section of the Populist Party movement, but not all populists follow Bryan into the Democratic Party. And among those who don't, many are attracted to the Socialist Party of America, and they actually prove very capable organizers. They organize farmers' cooperatives and various civil social associations. And the party is open to them. And one reason why, if you read Kautsky's letter to the I'm sorry, it's not letter to the American worker. I believe it's a writing of Kautsky circa 1906 on the situation of farmers in the United States. And one thing he points out there is that historically, what the land meant, what a farm meant in the United States, is that anyone with a bit of hard work and talent could leave the proletarian condition of the cities and become a sort of yeoman farmer, right? And this opportunity to do so starts to close in the 1890s. And by the early 1900s, it seems fundamentally limited. And so I think this in part explains the appeal of the Socialist Party to farmers and to some of the populist constituency, right? Because it's no longer the glory days of the yeoman who can just escape the city and quote unquote escape capitalism, connecting back with Spencer's presentation, right? That is closing precisely in this period. And so populism is expressing that, but precisely because that closing is bound up with imperialism, with monopoly, the populist currents in American politics, to at least some degree, become very sympathetic to the Socialist Party, and the party is able to organize them.
I'm going to exercise my authority as the moderator to prioritize Naomi. If you want to come speak.
Well, my name is Naomi, I'm with the Socialist Workers' Party. I just wanted to raise, I think it's important when you're talking about this whole period to recognize we're talking about two different stages in class. The whole period of the 1800s is the period of the bourgeois democratic revolutions, of which from the late 1700s through the period of the Paris Commune and so forth, and where you have capitalism these are progressive revolutions against, overturning feudalism, including the, fight against was basically a feudal type system that the Spanish legacy in Mexico had been. And that's part of what was involved in the Spanish-American War, which gets misunderstood today, in light of what developed very rapidly after the Civil War. You have the beginnings of the development of monopoly capitalism, of imperialism. And the Second International was basically destroyed by the First World Imperialist slaughter, because the leadership of almost every single one of the parties of the Second International support their own bourgeoisies in that war, including the American Socialist Party, with exceptions. I mean, the American Socialist Party was divided. Debs was against the war, but that's why he went to jail. But as a party, he left the party to be dominated by the right wing of the Socialist Party. And you had the Bolshevik Revolution, which showed the possibility, of actually doing what the Paris Commune showed the beginnings of, but the working class taking and holding state power. And so anyway, I think it's just important to remind, it's like, to talk about going back to a Debsian type socialist party after the example of the Bolshevik Revolution, the possibilities, it's a total, there's a lot to learn from this period, but in terms of what kind of party needs to be built today, it has nothing to do with the Debsian period of the Socialist Party. In my opinion, the greatest weakness of Debs, and he had many, many strengths, but the greatest weakness was not seeing the need of building a party that could really lead the fight for political power, and did a great disservice, because he was a supporter of the Bolshevik Revolution, but couldn't see his way to building a Bolshevik type party in the United States.
Can I just respond really quick?
I guess this gets to some of the issues of lessons of liberalism and crisis of liberalism, and what kind of lesson was the Paris Commune for Lenin, and why we might revisit the Paris Commune as a crisis of liberalism in the 19th century in order to provoke a kind of recognition of Lenin's politics. So I guess just to clarify that it's not a move away from Lenin, but rather the question is a deepening of our understanding of what it meant to be a socialist in 1917 and inherit the task of the Paris Commune in a new age. And maybe that's lost. There's been a kind of loss in transmission, and how we return to that problem of continuity and discontinuity, this problem of historical consciousness today, right, without the international. I guess that's sort of what the panel is trying to do. Like, what was the lesson that Lenin supposedly was acting on? Just if I may, briefly on this issue of liberalism in the United States, on the Whig Party and the Republican Party. I mean, so there's Henry Clay, and then there's Lincoln. And Lincoln is a break in the way in which the Whig Party presented itself as the expansion of commerce, finance, and the splinter, if you will, within the 1820s and the 1830s are these working men parties who then tap into this Ricardian socialist critique. And Marx wrote of these people that what they had rediscovered was the problem of the theory of value, through Benjamin Franklin. And that's why they become a sort of object of critique for him. But in a sense, the Republican Party does break with that emphasis. Like Lincoln is a student of Clay, but he still believes that there is this harmony of capital and labor, that you can, in fact, have free labor in the United States in ways in which, for Sorga, with the lessons from Europe, right, which we could say, okay, maybe he's wrong, maybe he's right, or he has this kind of different temporality. He doesn't think that that's possible, like already before Lincoln does. So, yeah.
Just in response to that, it occurs to me that the American Socialist Party during the 19-teens has a kind of Sphinx-like character that seems to be pointing both towards the Bolshevik Party in Russia as well as to the SPD in Germany in terms of how you would characterize it, especially in relation to the war, right? Because on the one hand, the party remains anti-war, pretty stridently, at least in its pronouncements. And so much so that a lot of the leading intellectuals in the party, people like William English Walling and very influential ex-socialist Walter Lippmann, leave the party. There are a whole host of others on account of the war, right? Many of them actually helped the Wilson.
war. Yeah.
Yes, because they cannot remain in the party and support the war, so they leave the party. And the party actually gains a lot of recruits during this period who are anti-war because it has an anti-war position. Again, maybe even picking up some populist currents who are anti-war and want to support the anti-war party. On the other hand, you know, if you read the book, for example, The Sewer Socialist by Elmer Beck, you'll see that some of Victor Berger's lieutenants in his kind of municipal machine in Milwaukee do end up collaborating in these tripartite state, industry, labor boards and commissions that the progressives and the Wilson administration roll out during the period of the war, right? So there's a bit of unofficial collaboration, official denunciation, right? But I was going to read something, and it's brief. It's a quote by the historian Jack Ross in his History of the Socialist Party of America, and he writes, "The thwarting of the potential of American socialism required the merciless domestic terror and repression of the Wilson administration during the First World War, the worst in American history and the worst, save perhaps in Tsarist Russia, of all the belligerents in the First World War. Thus did the suppression of the socialists and its wider ramifications prove a critical condition for America's rise as a world power," right? So Ross is essentially arguing that the Wilsonite terror was the condition of possibility for what we consider geopolitically to be the American century. And in that respect, I would just finally add that the historian Adam Hochschild last year published a book titled American Midnight, right? We're familiar with this concept of the 1940s, the midnight of the 20th century. Well, Hochschild says there's an American midnight, and it's when the Socialist Party is brutally repressed by the Wilson administration. So I think one has to acknowledge that the party was obviously deemed as a significant enough threat in the context of both its opposition to the war and, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution, the October Revolution, both sort of combined to make the party, in the eyes of the U.S. capitalist state, seem dangerous enough to very brutally suppress.
Okay. So this is a question about the idea of being both advanced and backwards at the same time, which means advanced in a bourgeois revolution, backwards in socialist class consciousness that characterized both Britain and America in the period of the Second International. And Chris mentioned this idea of whether the Socialist Party is a phenomenon of the Second Industrial Revolution and therefore no longer with us, or whether parts of the Second Industrial Revolution are still with us and therefore this question is still there. But I'd like to put forward a different kind of view or a different problem, which I think was a fairly common view, which is that there was a kind of British-American problem as opposed to continental success, and that the SPA was never a mass party. And recently in Platypus, there was a discussion about this article by Kautsky, Sects or Mass Parties, which I think it's important to note was popularly circulated by ex-ISO types during the Bernie Sanders DSA kind of neo-Kautskian revival. And it's about the debate over the Labour Party and the British Labour Party and the Second International. And there's this whole debate with Theodore Rothstein and Karl Radek and Max Beer, and they're, the former two are critical of Kautsky, but Kautsky basically says that in Britain and America, if I'm remembering correctly, you basically don't have a mass socialist party. This is in 1908. And therefore it's acceptable for the small socialist parties to maintain separate existence on the hope that they will at some point fuse with a larger Labour Party. And that's the task facing Britain and America, which is not the same task as what was, and that he wouldn't tolerate anything like that in Germany, where there already was a mass socialist party. So that is connected to this question implicitly by Kautsky, very explicitly by Theodore Rothstein in an early article called "Why is Socialism at a Discount in Britain?", which is that Britain and America had early and very advanced bourgeois revolutions, and that the character of socialism on the continent is precisely because of their backwardness at the level of bourgeois, like liberal development. They're illiberal lands, Germany, Russia. France is this kind of weird in between Britain and Germany. So what do we make of that? I think it's a quite different view from some of the assumptions on this panel, to some extent. And I'd just like to get, if anyone has a response to that.
If I could just say one thing about that. So it sounds to me that Kautsky was looking forward to something in Britain and the United States happening that was similar to the Gotha unification of the Lassalleans and the Marxists. Because the Lassalleans, despite being hostile to the workers' economic struggles, they were the working class organizers. In comparison to the Eisenachers, to the Marxists, they had a much larger membership following a much larger base in the working class. And so, again, to analogize, and it's a curious thing, because of course we know that the Labour Party was established by the Fabians, and the Fabians were admirers of Bismarck, as was Lassalle. Right, so there's a kind of a paradox there. So I think that Kautsky, I mean, if you want my off-the-cuff response, Ephraim, my off-the-cuff response is that this is Kautsky falling victim to his own linear view of history, right, that actually would neglect precisely what you're saying, the backward and advanced character, not being like a paradox, but being a contradiction. I mean, what I was saying about the Second Industrial Revolution, it's not that, I mean, we still live in the world of the Second Industrial Revolution, of course. You know, we're still illuminated by electricity, etc. But really the point is the recurrent crises of capitalism. In other words, are the recurrent crises of capitalism and recurrent regenerations of capitalism opportunities for building a socialist party? Or was there just that one moment of the Second Industrial Revolution for doing so? And again, that's where Kautsky would see, you know, there is something of a paradox, namely that the Lassalleans really do represent the failure of 1848 in Germany. They represent the democratic republicanism as a current in Germany. Instead of, like, so the bourgeoisie in Germany abdicated on that, so the workers had to take up the struggle, and that's why they're the Social Democrats, right? Like, in many respects, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, why they're the Social Democrats as opposed to the Socialists, that is a concession, if you will, to the Lassalleanism. However, maybe getting back to Wyatt's question, so Marxism did have a view of mass politics, and the view of mass politics was that the workers should lead the middle class, right? That the workers should lead the broader democratic struggle, should indeed lead the broader liberal struggle, that otherwise left in the hands of the middle class will be quite treacherous, and certainly under the leadership of the middle class will be disastrous for the working class. So again, that would be my kind of riposte to that, would be like, well, I wonder whether he just thinks that they have to sort of reproduce this history that Germany had experienced.
Just very briefly, I recall reading recently one of the SPA leaders and Marxists, and I can't remember exactly if it's Debs or Berger or someone else, but they were discussing precisely this, the kind of comparison of the prospects for the Socialist Party in Germany vis-a-vis the United States. And they state that on the one hand, prospects could seem much better in the United States because of this bourgeois revolutionary heritage, right, and the sort of backward political character of Germany. But they go on to observe that because the working class movement for socialism has grown so powerful in Germany by the 1890s and 1900s, the state in Germany is actually able to get away with far less suppression of organized labor and of the Socialist Party there than it's often able to do in the United States. We were talking about the South, but that's only
Right.
one example, of course. And so I think you see in that notion the idea that the societal power of the party and of the movement has actually put a check on the state, and it has in some ways rendered less important the fact that the state at a kind of political level appears to be more backward, because actually the prospects for the party could be greater.
I want to take it back a little bit to sort of the earlier history. The way in which Britain and America are both advanced and backward is radically different in the minds of socialists in the 1840s.
Different from each other.
Different from each other.
Yeah.
First of all, the question of America, as I try to speak about it, is bound up with the question of the New World, right? It's not just a question of the United States, just as the stakes of the Civil War is not just a question of the United States. The question of the New World as a refuge for European labor or European descent, all of those things, right? It's the the Balabarian Revolution. All of these things are the promise of the New World is bound up with the American Revolution and with the Monroe Doctrine in the early 19th century, and and so the question of the expansion of the settlement, agriculture, reaching the Pacific Ocean, all of these questions that have been present since the very discovery of the New World. The kind of comment that you get from L'Abbé Raynal or Adam Smith that the discovery of America marks an epoch in world history, right? It's like that's still there, right? And within that is the legacy of the American Revolution in 1776. And to come back to Adam Smith, right, the question of the backwardness of Britain has to do with the crisis of the Whig Revolution, right? In other words, the American Revolution is an expression of the crisis of the revolution and the empire as a whole, right? I would say this is the defining question of the High Enlightenment, right? It's the defining question of, why does the Enlightenment cease to be Anglophile? Right? Why does, obviously, the Enlightenment is, in a sense, defined by its admiration for John Locke and for Sir Isaac Newton, straight down through Montesquieu. And the Rousseauian aftermath is really a crisis of that, and it's conditioned by the American crisis, is conditioned by the 7 Years' War and its aftermath, which, after all, is a huge crisis of the British political system. Right? And what does it mean to be a Whig? What does it mean to be a Tory? And obviously, the Tories have ceased to be in any way connected to Stuart Restoration and the Jacobite impulse. And the Whig crisis, the Whig Party cannot emerge from the American crisis unscathed, right? Which is why William Pitt, Lord Chatham gets up in the House of Lords and says, I'm glad to know that I can die with the knowledge that the Whig Revolution, the cause of the Whig Revolution is safe, if only across the water, right? And of course, that problem is compounded by Great Britain organizing what Marx calls the anti-Jacobin War. Right, so taking all of this together, Marx speaks of the debt that Great Britain has to the revolution to the 18th century. Right? It's a phrase he uses repeatedly, the debt of Britain to the revolution of the 18th century. And that gets to the way in which people think, and obviously the Chartism is taking up demands, respecting what? Respecting the heart, the betrayal of the heart of the glorious revolution. Respecting the failure of Parliament to adequately represent civil society. Right, that's where demands for the reform of the suffrage are made. When is universal suffrage demanded? 1776, right, by London radicals. And the Chartists are very aware of that. Right, and the inadequacy of the reform bill to address it, right? That it hasn't actually shaken to the core the old party political system that was effectively created by the American crisis. And so when you're, and of course you're combining that, I think in the minds of socialists, unique situation, right, of not the absence of a presence of a bourgeois revolution, but of a bourgeois revolution that has itself already entered into crisis, right? And that's why people in Britain today actually aren't sure, right? Is there an English Revolution, right? I mean, obviously, as a historian, I ask, right, what do you guys think about your revolution and your Bill of Rights, et cetera, right? And they're like, what are you talking about? Right, there's a civil war, right?
And now they call it the War of the Three Kingdoms.
Right.
The Glorious Revolution is the War of the Three Kingdoms.
Right,
Oh
exactly.
my God.
And so, I think that, when Marx speaks of Britain as the demiurgos of the bourgeois cosmos, he's talking about, of course, the 18th Brumaire. Right? He is addressing what, I quoted Engels as discussing, right? We are going to plant the working class in the state, right? Julian Harney will be in Lord Palmerston's shoes, right? That is the project of the Revolution of 1848. I think what that would mean for America is very uncertain. I think they just sort of take for granted that America would be an ally to that socialist revolutionary project. But it is about addressing, that the heart of the problem of the Revolution of 1848 is the political backwardness that arises from a society that is both, of course, the most industrialized and the site of this sort of self-betrayal of the bourgeois revolution.
And if I could just put two additional points on that. I mentioned the U.S. South, right, as a sort of region in the wake of the failure of Reconstruction that sort of makes a mockery of the promise of bourgeois revolution, right, in the United States. But some additional examples that are quite relevant would be the cities. There's a book in this period, I believe, by Lincoln Steffens, Shame of the Cities, that they become massive sites of graft, corruption, patronage, that
Gangs of New York.
Gangs of New York, exactly. And this is already in the mid-20th century, but the Gilded Age becomes very characteristic of this, right? And then at the same time, you have, labor should have the right of free speech, of free assembly, but you have the U.S. courts and the police and the state pretty constantly interfering, right, against the labor movement in various strikes and actions, even in consumer boycotts. The state tries to interfere, the courts try to interfere. And so in some ways, paradoxically, it's easier for the Socialist Party to win municipal governing power, to win a city government election in Germany in a free and fair election than it is in many places in the United States. And it's easier for the labor movement to conduct a strike or a boycott in many cases in Germany during this period than it is in the United States. So again, it sort of, from that perspective, I think this notion of backwardness sort of changes because it becomes about the prospects for the party.
Just wanted to say that this issue of the crisis, like the bourgeois society in crisis, how it seems though the working men already by Jackson's time have this capacity to gain political power, that they don't register like bourgeois society in crisis, that that's essentially the task of the International. That's what it was supposed to do. Kind of like bring to the United States the historical experience of acknowledging the bourgeois society in crisis, not as a national problem, but as an international problem. And somehow it's not successful in doing so. And it faces resistance from people who, well into like later 19th century, are going to hold on to the idea that there's this other path, this other historical future in the United States, which is possible. And even those who support, who support Louis Blanc and others, are just going to say, well, you just need to come to the United States, that you can realize your society here. And there's something that the socialists in America understood that was not possible, and somehow it's not registered in the US. Like that seems to be its backward political character.
Okay, unfortunately, we'll have to cut the discussion at this point, but that doesn't mean the discussion's over. This is just the beginning of the conference. So our next event is going to be in a different room, so we're changing rooms now. It's going to be Kent Lab, room 120. So you're going to have to clean up the trash around you and just make sure everything looks nice. And it will start at 3 p.m. sharp, so be there on time. And after that event... It's on main campus?
I don't know, where's Kent?
Where is Kent Lab? There's someone who knows.
It's like a 5-minute walk.
It's a 5-minute walk.
It's in the quad?
Yeah. It's in the quad. Okay, hopefully that helps. The event's going to be on broadcasting and publishing in Platypus, and then after that event we have a talk from the Socialist Workers' Party. The low point of labor resistance is behind us. The Socialist Workers' Party looks forward. So looking forward to continuing the discussion, and see you guys in the next event.